May 14, 1787. 55 delegates from the newly formed United States gathered in the Philadelphia State House to revise the Articles of Confederation and restructure the government. In doing so, the architects of the Constitution had to confront the contradiction between establishing a government based upon liberty and freedom in a country that allowed slavery. James Madison, a Virginia delegate, was too familiar with the contradictions between slavery and freedom in his personal life. James Madison, Jr. was born into a slave-holding family in 1751. Madison's grandfather, Ambrose Madison, and his father, James Madison, Sr., both owned slaves. Writing to his father in 1783, Madison reflected on his decision to sell one of his personal slaves, Billy, asking his father, "Why should Billy be punished?"
For coveting that liberty for which we have paid the price of so much blood and have proclaimed so often to be right and worthy the pursuit of every human being.
James Madison decided to sell Billy to a Quaker because he knew that the servitude would only last a maximum 7 years. It is no surprise that Madison recognized the divisions emerging between those states that supported slavery and those that were weary of it as the convention began. Madison states,
"The institution of slavery and its consequences formed the line of discrimination."
It was undeniable that slavery was at the heart of the debates. Slavery underlined the issues of representation and taxation and the distribution of power amongst the states. Delegates often considered black slaves as both property and people when it was convenient to their argument. Consequently, delegates agreed to consider slaves 3/5 of a human being. The delegates wrote the 3/5 Compromise for representation in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3. Delegates agreed to grant the federal government power to end the slave trade in 1808 in Article 1, Section 9, Paragraph 1. However, the delegates also agreed to include the nation's first fugitive slave measure in stating that every runaway slave must be returned to his or her owner. Some delegates even suggested that allowing the Constitution to sanction slavery invited divine judgment on the new nation. Virginia delegate George Mason declared,
"Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities."
Despite the compromises, Benjamin Franklin urged delegates to sign the Constitution and advocate for its ratification because he doubted
whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution.
Delegates uninterested in writing slavery into the Constitution knew they had opted for compromise. The delegates left it up to later generations to solve this problem. Little did they know that sacrificing black slaves in their effort to create a more perfect union in 1787 sowed the seeds of the disunion of the new constitutional republic in 1861. Meanwhile, black slaves waged their struggle against slavery. They aspired to force the new country to live up to the professed ideals written in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. 34 hours after the first shots, Confederate soldiers, black slaves, and local onlookers watched as the Union forces raised their white flag. The Battle of Fort Sumter was over. Major Anderson surrendered the fort. The American Civil War had begun. One must wonder what were on the minds of the slaves as they watched the cannonballs pummel the fort with the same force that would help usher in a new era of freedom only 2 years later. The blacks' war against slavery had now merged with the nation's war to save the Union.